I am ready. Good. Down with for speech. I want to tell you how I got interested in this. It started 45 years ago when my daughter, who's now 50, can you imagine that, was 5 years old, and she was playing with a friend in the neighborhood. And I was asked to go over to the friend's house, pick up my daughter and her little friend, and bring them both to our house because the friend's mom had to go off to Santa Monica Community College and take her Spanish class. So I cheerfully went over there, looking forward to seeing my daughter and her friend. And when I walked in, told our friend, I'm ready to go. I'll take the kids and leave. And she said, wait, I have to go take my pill. You have to take your what? Yeah, I have to take my medication. Now, we were pretty good family friends, so I felt comfortable enough to ask her, what's wrong? What do you have to take? In the kitchen and take some Valium. Valium 50 years ago was what people were taking for anxiety. Now they take Prozac and other stuff. And again, we had a good relationship, so I said, why are you taking Valium? It's Spanish class. It freaks me out. It makes me so nervous. And I said, what is it? I asked her, what is it about Spanish class that has you so upset? Having to talk. I'm afraid I'm being called on in class and I'll have to say something in Spanish. I might make a mistake. I'll be humiliated. Very interesting. Well, I got very interested. This is the first I had heard of this. I was a beginner in this field. And I got interested and I looked at some of the research on anxiety and language classes. The question is, what is it about language classes that is the most anxiety provoking? They had given students all kinds of questionnaires. Speaking. My neighbor was right. She was the same as everybody else. Having to speak the language in class. In terms of my work, what this means to me is having to say things that you may have learned, but you haven't acquired yet. They don't come out easily. I looked at the research, she was right. Study done in 1991, greatest source of anxiety in foreign language, having to speak. Study done in 1992, students in beginning French classes. Speaking was the highest anxiety-provoking activity. In a study in foreign language in the United States, 50% said the main problem was speaking. Same thing with English as a foreign language in China. And I found just remarks that teachers have made about this. A colleague of ours who teaches English in France, Judith Dubois, included this in one of her papers. I asked my students to write about a frightening experience, any frightening experience. Almost a quarter of the class wrote about being called on in class. Wow. I think this is especially pronounced. Benico Mason has pointed out this to me. When it's public, private is one thing, but when it's absolutely in public and people are watching you, etc. So can we just reduce forced speech or even eliminate it? People might object to it. If you want to get better in speaking, don't you have to speak? No. The work we've been doing for the last 45 years or so says no. You don't get better in speaking from speaking. Being able to speak fluently and easily is the result of language acquisition, not the cause. And this has been confirmed in a few studies. Judith Gary, 1975. We've known about this for a long time. 2 classes. She taught 2 classes. In one of them, no speaking was required for 5 months in her Spanish class. That class did better in listening, and the same in speaking. It didn't hurt, and it might even have helped. Another study, Rahim Sari, who works in Turkey, was teaching an intensive English class. This is a class that students take before they go on to the university and have most of their work done in English, so it's preparation. The class, 2 classes again, the class that did more voluntary reading and listening and did less grammar study, less writing, did better on a speaking test. Now, in addition to these studies, and I hope we'll see more, there are less rigorous studies, but fascinating, that come to the same conclusion. I wouldn't say this is hard evidence, but it certainly is interesting, and we can't ignore it. Back in the 60s, the 60s, another topic. Anyway, back in the 60s, anthropologists started getting interested in this, especially a guy named Sorensen. 1967 did a very interesting study of indigenous people in South America in the Valpes River area where Colombia and Brazil have a mutual border. In this area, he studied a group of 10,000 people. Now, I got to tell you, 10,000 is not very many people. If you go to a big football match and there's only 10,000 people there, it's kind of embarrassing. This group, though, spoke many, many different languages. 24 different languages, 10,000 people. They were not all mutually intelligible. Some of the languages were completely unrelated. They also had a very interesting rule in this culture. You are not allowed to marry someone who speaks your language. They considered outsiders, we do this all the time. We marry people, we speak the same language. They thought that was incestuous and disgusting, all right? Well, in this group, kids grow up doing lots of languages. They acquire mommy's language, daddy's language, the local lingua franca, the common language of the subgroup they're in, languages of the wider group. And Sorensen points out that during adolescence, quoting Sorensen, an individual actively and almost suddenly begins to speak 2 or 3 other languages that he's been exposed to. How do they do it? We have to take a look at these people. Now, we haven't given them language tests, recorded them, etc. So again, this is, you might call it anecdotal, but still, it's very interesting. By the way, they're not corrected. There is a social prohibition against correcting people for anything. Some of you are thinking, I wish that were true in my family. Okay. How do they do it? They don't practice speaking a language if they don't know it. Again, I'm quoting Sorensen. They make an occasional attempt to speak a new language, but if it does not come easily, they do not try to force it. Very different from what we do in language class. How long does it take? It takes a year or two until they get a reasonable competence in the other language of just listening, getting a feel for it, etc. Wow. What Sorensen says is that we ought to look at cultures like this before we come to our confident conclusions about what we should do in language classes. When I was a beginning student of language teaching, etc., one of the people I admired was a guy named Eugene Nida, Nida, who wrote a book on language teaching, 1957. This paragraph is so interesting that I'm going to recite the whole thing to you. I have inquired of a number of African polyglots just how they learned the language of neighboring tribes. Almost without exception, the story is the same. They went to live in a neighboring village or in the mines. They were working with people who spoke another language. Instead of trying hard to learn the language, they just seemed to take it for granted. I love take it for granted that after listening to the language long enough, they'd find they could hear it. To hear it means to understand it. We just live there and listen. And before we know it, we can hear what they are saying. That's understanding it. Then we can talk. Comprehension precedes production. Well, another case is a case history. Again, one case history is not proof. I know that. But a lot of them, we need to pay attention. I'm still bitter about this one. I could have been famous. I could have had a real career and a reputation. This guy blew it for me. I got a call from the Los Angeles Times. The reporter, and he's the one who didn't mention me in the article. Oh, my. It's happened to all of us. He was writing an article about immigrants to the Los Angeles area who came when they were quite young and took jobs in restaurants. They acquired English quite well. Most of them were from Mexico. They acquired English quite well, but they also acquired the language of the restaurant, if it was a language, with another tradition, and a restaurant with another culinary tradition. He asked me to come to the San Fernando Valley and visit an Israeli restaurant and meet a young man named Armando. Armando had come to the United States when he was around 12 and had been working in this Israeli restaurant. And this guy says, you got to meet this guy. Not only is his English really good, but he speaks Hebrew too. So I got there, I met Armando. Important footnote, I think, Armando was very friendly. You know the kind of people when you meet them, they look you in the eye and like you're a real human being, and they're happy to meet you, and they're interested in what you have to say. Little political comment. My son, who's a mathematician, went to a reception where he and a number of other young researchers in science met the president, Barack Obama, and Danny was very impressed with him. When you meet him, he shakes your hand, we don't do that anymore, and he looks you in the eye and listens to what you're saying and responds, clearly showing he's happy to meet you and involved in the conversation. This is the impression Armando gave me. I went to a conference about 2 years ago in Montreal on polyglots. And all these young polyglots were there, people mostly in their 20s, early 30s, who spoke just this amazing range of languages. And I noticed that they had the same personality type. When you meet them, they're happy to meet you. They're very proud of their colleagues, not just themselves and how many languages they speak. You've got to hear this guy speak Romanian. He's really good, etc. So maybe this personality has something to do with it, just an observation. Well, Armando told me in English that he speaks English. He obviously speaks English quite well. But he says, I actually think I speak Hebrew better. We talked about it. It took him a couple of years, 2 to 3 years, just like these previous cases, just like we found with Sorensen's cases, until he was really comfortable. He never forced himself to speak. He just hung out and listened to people, gradually picked it up. Again, important footnote, these people had a long silent period. If you go to a good language class, you won't have a 2 to 3 year silent period. Go to a story listening class that has been demonstrated for you, and you'll be speaking well before that. The real world is not very cooperative in giving you comprehensible input for beginners, but language classes are, which is why they're so good. He said he had never studied Hebrew grammar, could not read Hebrew, had no interest in going to Israel, was not interested in converting to Judaism. His connection was with the people in the restaurant. He was very friendly with the customers and the family. The family liked him so much. When he was in an automobile accident, he was put in a hospital for about 10 days. It was quite serious. And the family sent over breakfast, lunch, and dinner from the restaurant kitchens the entire time he was there and visited him every day. They liked him. He got along well with the customers. They enjoyed chatting with him in Hebrew, of course. So how good was he? Well, I had to give him a test. I took out a device that I'm sure some of you don't know about, so I have to explain it to you. It's called a tape recorder. A tape recorder, they're obsolete now. They're these little boxes, and you put in something called a tape. You just fit it in, and you can record people, and it works very well. So I sat down with my tape recorder. They knew what it was, had their permission. Armando and his best friend, who was a young man his age from the family. And I asked them to have a conversation in Hebrew. And tell me what you did yesterday. Fortunately, I know some Hebrew, and I was able to follow the conversation, and I was prepared to, move it along if necessary, but really wasn't necessary. They were such good pals, it was easy for them to talk. I then took the tape recording, about a 5-minute recording, to Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles, went to a building where the Israeli consulate was and tourist offices. I walked into the office and I explained what I wanted. Said, I'd like some of you to listen to this tape. I told them who I was and that I was a professor doing research. And several people were happy to do it. I said, would you evaluate this guy, his language? 4 people did it for me, 2 from the tourist office and 2 from the consulate. the range of reactions. The least impressive reaction, he's pretty good. He speaks English very well. He's quite comfortable. He's obviously lived in Israel for a while and is, doing well. The most impressive evaluation, one person said he's obviously a native speaker of Hebrew. So this ranges from extremely good to native, which is quite impressive. What this shows is you can get this, and you can have a silent period, and you can acquire it, as we say, and it's, I think, pretty good evidence that talking is not what makes these things happen. My conclusions on what we call the silent period, which they went through. It supports a hypothesis I used to call the pleasure hypothesis. I don't talk about it much anymore because it's easily misunderstood, and you'll see why. The way I stated it then, activities perceived to be unpleasant don't help you. If you don't like what's going on, your affective filter goes up, you won't get a lot of input, you won't make progress. Activities things we do that we perceive to be pleasant are the ones that count. Now, here's why I've kind of dropped this, because it's easy to get confused. I am not saying if you like it, it's good for you. We fill our language classes, some of us do I've done this, with things kids do, which are a lot of fun. That doesn't mean it's good for language acquisition. I stated in a weaker way, if it's unpleasant, it's not going to help. The obvious practical implication of all this, don't force speaking. Don't down with force speaking. Don't make people talk until they're ready. Don't require speaking. Also, don't test speaking. Let me give you the case against testing speaking. First of all, it causes all kinds of anxiety. Kids know they're going to be tested on speaking. Usually they're put in a conversation with a teacher or someone else, or they're asked to describe pictures or something. We record them, and they know they're going to be evaluated for their accuracy of language, and it does make people pretty nervous. Number two, statistically, it doesn't work out very well. It's very hard to do inter-rater reliability. You don't know if two different raters, you want to see if different raters will give pretty much the same reaction. They don't. People vary enormously in how they evaluate speech, unless, as in the case of Armando, it's obviously very good. So easy way, don't require it, don't test it. We don't have to test it. Speaking, the language tests that we give, this is John Aller's work from years ago, correlate very highly with each other. If someone is a good reader and a good listener, they're going to be good speakers as well. We really don't need this. It's the most expensive test to give. You have to record the students. You have to, transcribe it, et cetera, et cetera. So let's save the profession a lot of money in terms of time. Let's save the students a lot of anxiety. Let's reduce the amount of testing, necessary testing. My bumper sticker says no unnecessary testing. Well, people argue for speaking that you really got to do it. Say if they don't speak, how do we know how good they are? How can we correct their errors? Well, error correction, my theory of error correction, is that error correction is really a form of conscious learning. When you make a mistake, and you're corrected, what you're supposed to do is change your version of the rule that you learned. Doesn't work very well. Good studies. My favorite researcher on this is a guy named John Truscott, who works in Taiwan, and his papers, I think, are very, very clear. Correction has either no effect or a very fragile effect. It disappears right away. Also, correction is not that frequent. How could it have a big effect? We can pump it up and give the impression it's important by having more of it in language classes. But in the real world, how often does it happen? My own experience, and one of the most pleasant hobbies I have is trying to acquire languages. And I do talk to people in other languages a lot. And nobody corrects me. How interesting. In fact, I can't remember any time, even in France, okay? When people will say, no, ce n'est pas comme ça, where they say, they change it. No, very rarely. Important because it's a domain for what's called comprehensible output. And this is a theory that was going around about 15 years ago from my friend and colleague Meryl Swain, but we disagree on this one. She says she likes comprehensible input, but also she says we acquire language, we try to say something and we don't, and it's incomprehensible because we've made a grammatical mistake. And we correct ourselves, and that's how we arrive at the right version. Okay, so for example, I'm speaking French with someone, I'm sure I make a lot of mistakes, and they ask me, have you ever been to France? And I say, oui, je suis allé, or no, I say, j'ai allé à France beaucoup de fois. They say, oh, no, they say, I don't understand what you're saying. So I try it again. J'ai allé l'année passée à Paris. I say, no, I don't understand, because I've used the wrong auxiliary verb. I use to have instead of to be, and therefore they don't understand. So I correct myself. I remember the right rule. They say, oh, je suis allé. And they say, oh, now I understand. And this is how I get the rule right. This is extremely rare. Not only that, the errors rarely cause any problem in comprehension. The late acquired rules of language are mostly cosmetic. They rarely make an important contribution. Third person singular, you can communicate quite well without it. And in my opinion, there's no direct evidence that it helps people. One more example, and then I'll stop. I give you examples from my experience because I think they're similar to what has happened to you. When I give demos, when I talk about comprehensible input in public, I like to start by giving people a language lesson. Now, the audience are experienced teachers. Mostly I give these to teachers in, high schools, universities, etc. And they're pretty competent and experienced in languages. I say, I'd like to give you a language lesson. And I leave the podium and start walking toward the audience, walking to a place where there are at least a few people seated close by. And I say to them, what goes through your mind when I leave the podium, cross the line of blood in the sand, and come right over to where you're sitting, and I say, I'm going to give you a language lesson? The universal response? Fear, panic, and they say so. They say, I'm afraid you're going to call on me. These are experienced professionals. This shows that forced speech makes people very, very nervous. They feel they're being evaluated. My conclusion from all this, very simple: down with forced speech. We can save time, we can save money, and make life a lot more pleasant for millions of language students. Thank you for your attention.